They were told the Americans would violate them, torture them, make them wish for death. When the enemy soldiers approached their barracks that first night in Okinawa, September 1945, 23 Japanese women huddled together in the darkness, arms linked, prepared for the worst. They heard boots on gravel. The door opened, and then the Americans did something none of them expected. They handed them wool blankets still warm from storage, and steaming cups of tea that smelled of sugar and comfort. The women stared at these offerings as if they were hallucinations. They had braced for violence. Instead, they received warmth, and that contradiction would haunt them far more than cruelty ever could. If stories like this move you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you forgotten true stories from World War II that reveal the complicated humanity behind the headlines. The island of Okinawa in September 1945 was a graveyard dressed in tropical green. The Battle of Okinawa had ended 3 months earlier, leaving behind a landscape scarred by artillery, dotted with shattered buildings, and haunted by the ghosts of over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians who had died defending the island. The air still smelled faintly of smoke and salt, and the heat was suffocating, pressing down like a wet blanket even as evening approached. In a makeshift holding area near the coast, 23 Japanese women sat in the remains of what had once been a schoolhouse. The roof was half collapsed, exposing wooden beams to the sky. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. Through the gaps, they could see American tents stretching across the hillside, hundreds of them, white canvas gleaming in the fading light. The sound of English voices drifted on the breeze, along with the clatter of mess kits and the rumble of trucks on dirt roads. The women were dressed in torn civilian clothes, their hair unwashed, their faces gaunt from weeks of hiding in caves and tunnels during the final days of the battle. Some wore the remnants of military nurse uniforms, faded khaki stained with dirt and blood. Others had wrapped themselves in whatever fabric they could find. Their eyes were hollow, shadowed by exhaustion and fear. They ranged in age from 18 to 40, but every face bore the same haunted expression. Among them was a woman named Keiko, 24 years old, who had served as a battlefield nurse. She clutched a small cloth bag containing a few personal items: a comb with missing teeth, a photograph of her parents in Kyoto, and a letter she had written but never sent. Her hands trembled as she held it. She had seen terrible things during the battle. She had watched soldiers die screaming. She had helped carry wounded men through tunnels as American flamethrowers lit the world outside on fire. And now surrendered and captured, she waited for what came next. The smell hit them first when the Americans brought them to the holding area. It was food. Real food. The scent of cooking meat drifted from the American camp, rich and heavy, mixing with the aroma of fresh bread and coffee. For women who had survived on handfuls of rice and water from puddles, the smell was almost obscene in its abundance. Some felt their stomachs twist with hunger. Others felt nausea, their bodies too shocked by deprivation to process the idea of plenty. The sounds were equally strange. English commands barked in the distance, sharp and alien. The rumble of engines never stopped. Trucks, jeeps, bulldozers reshaping the island. Music played from somewhere, American music with horns and drums, cheerful and jarring against the backdrop of destruction. A soldier laughed nearby, the sound carrying across the evening air, and the women flinched at the casual joy in it. How could the enemy laugh? How could they play music? The war had just ended. The world was ash. Yet here they were, these Americans, living as if nothing had happened. Visual contrasts assaulted them everywhere they looked. The Americans were clean. Their uniforms were pressed, their faces shaved, their boots polished despite the mud and dust. They moved with energy and purpose, unbroken by the war that had shattered Japan. Meanwhile, the women looked at their own reflections in puddles and saw ghosts, dirty, ragged, defeated. The gulf between victor and vanquished had never felt so vast. The physical sensations were overwhelming. The heat pressed down on them, but there was also a breeze from the ocean, carrying the salt smell of the sea. Their mouths were dry, their throats parched. Their bodies ached from weeks of sleeping on stone floors in caves. Some had injuries that had never been properly treated. Bandages made from torn clothing covered wounds that festered in the tropical heat. Every breath hurt. Every movement reminded them of their fragility. When the Americans first approached the schoolhouse that afternoon, the women's reactions were instant and primal. Some scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the far wall. Others froze, unable to move, their eyes wide with terror. A few began to cry silently, tears sliding down their cheeks as they waited for what they had been promised would happen. Keiko felt her chest tighten, her breath coming in short gasps. She had been told since childhood what would happen if she fell into enemy hands. The propaganda had been clear and graphic. American soldiers were animals, beasts who would defile Japanese women without mercy. Death was preferable to capture. She had a small knife hidden in her bag. She had considered using it on herself, but something had stopped her. Fear of pain. Or perhaps a tiny, irrational flicker of hope that the propaganda might be wrong. Beside her, a younger woman named Yumi whispered in a shaking voice, "They are coming for us. It is nightfall. They will come." Her words were not a question, but a statement of certainty. All the women knew. The stories had been too consistent, too detailed, too emphatic. Japanese soldiers had told them, officers had warned them, civilians had repeated the tales. American soldiers would do unspeakable things once darkness fell. It was not a matter of if, but when. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned from orange to purple to deep blue, the women huddled closer together. Some held hands, others prayed silently to ancestors or gods they were not sure were listening anymore. The room filled with the sound of shallow breathing and stifled sobs. Outside, the American camp grew louder with evening activity, and the women waited, braced for the horror they had been promised. Wait. The fear lingered. Every step of the soldiers outside felt like a countdown to violation. Every shadow in the doorway seemed to herald the beginning of their nightmare. They did not know yet that the nightmare they expected would never come. They did not know that the real shock would be something far more difficult to process than violence. They could not imagine that the enemy they feared was about to offer them something their own leaders never had. Dignity. Night fell completely. The schoolhouse had no lights, so the women sat in near total darkness, broken only by the faint glow from American floodlights in the distance. The tropical night was alive with sounds. Insects buzzed and chirped. Somewhere a gecko clicked its rhythmic call. But above all that, the women heard boots on gravel. The footsteps approached the schoolhouse. Heavy boots. Multiple men. The women pressed closer together, forming a tight cluster in the corner, farthest from the door. Keiko felt Yumi's fingernails digging into her arm. Someone whimpered. Another woman began to recite a Buddhist prayer under her breath, the words tumbling out in a desperate whisper. The door creaked open. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the room. The women squinted against the sudden light, their hearts pounding so hard they could hear the blood rushing in their ears. Silhouettes appeared in the doorway. 3 American soldiers, tall and broad-shouldered, their faces hidden in shadow behind the flashlight. This is it, Keiko thought. This is when it happens. Her hand moved to the knife in her bag. She thought of her mother. She thought of the stories she had been told. She prepared herself to fight, to scream, to die if necessary. The other women were rigid with terror, some covering their faces, others staring at the soldiers with wide, unblinking eyes. And then one of the soldiers spoke. His voice was gentle, almost apologetic. He said something in English that none of them understood, but the tone was wrong. It was not aggressive. It was not threatening. It was almost concerned. The soldier stepped forward, and the women flinched as one, pressing back against the wall. But he stopped immediately, holding up his hands in what seemed to be a calming gesture. Another soldier came forward, carrying something. In the beam of the flashlight, they could see it now. Blankets. Thick wool blankets, the kind the American military issued to its own troops. The soldier held them out, offering them to the women. No one moved, no one breathed. The women stared at the blankets as if they were weapons in disguise. The third soldier carried a large metal container. He set it down carefully near the door and lifted the lid. Steam rose from inside, carrying the unmistakable scent of tea. Hot tea. The soldier produced metal cups and began pouring, the liquid steaming in the cool night air. He placed the cups on the floor, within reach of the women, then stepped back. The 3 soldiers stood there for a moment, looking at the terrified women huddled in the corner. One of them said something else in English, his tone gentle. Then they turned and left, pulling the door closed behind them. Their footsteps retreated across the gravel, and the women were alone again, staring at the blankets and tea that had been left behind. For a long moment no one moved. The women stared at the offerings as if they might disappear at any second, or transform into something sinister. Keiko's mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This was not the scenario she had been prepared for. Where was the violence? Where was the assault? Where were the horrors she had been promised? "It is a trick," whispered an older woman named Sachiko, her voice hoarse. "They want us to trust them. Then they will come back." Several women nodded, their faces tight with suspicion. It made sense. The Americans were clever. Everyone knew that. This was psychological warfare, designed to lower their guard before the real attack began. But the night was cold. The schoolhouse had no walls on one side, open to the tropical air that turned surprisingly chilly after dark. The women were shivering in their thin, torn clothing. And the blankets were right there, folded neatly, so close they could touch them. The tea was still steaming, its warmth visible in the darkness. Yumi was the first to move. She was the youngest, just 18, and perhaps her youth made her more willing to take the risk. Or perhaps she was simply too cold to care anymore. She crawled forward slowly, her hand trembling, and touched one of the blankets. It was soft, real wool. She pulled it toward her, half expecting it to burn or bite or somehow hurt her. But it was just a blanket, warm and heavy and comforting. She wrapped it around her shoulders and closed her eyes, a small sound escaping her lips. Relief. Warmth. The other women watched her, waiting to see if something terrible would happen. But Yumi just sat there, wrapped in the American blanket, tears running down her face. One by one, the others reached for blankets. Keiko took one, her hands shaking, and pulled it around herself. The warmth was immediate and overwhelming. She had been cold for so long, sleeping on stone, hiding in caves, running through the jungle in torn clothes. The blanket felt like salvation. She pulled it tighter and felt something inside her begin to crack. The tea was next. Keiko picked up one of the cups, still hot to the touch. She brought it to her lips and sipped cautiously. It was sweet. The Americans had added sugar, a luxury the women had not tasted in years. The warmth of the liquid spread through her chest, down into her stomach, radiating through her cold, aching body. She drank it slowly, savoring each sip, and felt tears begin to flow. Around her, the other women were drinking too, wrapped in their blankets, crying softly in the darkness. They cried from relief. They cried from confusion. They cried because they had been prepared for horror and received kindness instead, and they did not know how to process that contradiction. Why? Yumi whispered into the darkness. Why would they do this? No one had an answer. The question hung in the air, unanswerable and troubling. Everything they had been told was wrong. Everything they had believed about the enemy was suddenly suspect, and that realization was more frightening than any violence could have been. The women slept that night, wrapped in American blankets, their stomachs warmed by sweet tea. It was the first real sleep many of them had experienced in months. Not the half-conscious dozing of someone waiting for bombs to fall, but actual sleep, deep and dreamless. When they woke at dawn, sunlight was streaming through the gaps in the roof, and for a moment some of them forgot where they were. Then memory returned. They were prisoners, captives of the American military. And yet they were alive, unharmed, covered in blankets that smelled faintly of American soap and cigarettes. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Keiko sat up and looked around at the other women, seeing her own confusion reflected in their faces. Sachiko, the older woman who had warned them it was a trick, was crying silently, her face buried in her blanket. When she looked up, her eyes were red and swollen. "I do not understand," she said quietly. "I do not understand any of this." Her voice broke on the last word. She had prepared herself for death or worse. She had made peace with it. But this unexpected kindness had shattered her carefully constructed defenses. Around mid-morning, the soldiers returned. The women tensed immediately, pulling their blankets tighter as if the fabric could protect them. But the soldiers only brought more tea, along with wooden crates. They set the crates down and opened them to reveal rations. American military rations. Canned food, crackers, chocolate bars. The soldiers gestured at the food, their expressions friendly, then left again without incident. The women stared at the food. Slowly, hesitantly, they approached the crates. Keiko picked up a can and examined it. The label was in English, incomprehensible to her, but the picture showed meat and vegetables. Her hands shook as she figured out how to open it. Inside was stew, thick and rich, with chunks of actual meat floating in gravy. The smell made her dizzy with hunger. She ate directly from the can, using her fingers at first, then finding a spoon someone else had discovered. The food was unlike anything she had eaten during the war. It was rich, fatty, satisfying in a way that rice and fish scraps had never been. She ate until her stomach hurt, and still she wanted more. Around her, the other women were doing the same, devouring the American rations with a desperation that bordered on frenzy. Yumi bit into a chocolate bar and made a sound of shocked pleasure. "It is sweet," she whispered in wonder. "So sweet." She broke the chocolate into pieces and shared it with the women nearest to her, all of them savoring the taste with expressions of disbelief. When had they last tasted chocolate? Before the war, surely. In another lifetime, when Japan was not yet destroyed and they were not yet prisoners waiting for horrors that never came. As the day wore on, more soldiers came and went, always bringing supplies, never threatening. They brought buckets of clean water. They brought medical supplies. One soldier even brought a basket of fresh fruit, papayas and bananas grown on the island, still warm from the sun. He smiled as he set it down, said something cheerful in English, and left. The women sat in the ruins of the schoolhouse, surrounded by American supplies, wrapped in American blankets, their stomachs full of American food, and they tried to reconcile this reality with everything they had been taught. The propaganda had been so clear, the warnings had been so dire, and yet here they were, treated with more care by the enemy than they had received from their own military in the final months of the war. Keiko looked down at her hands, stained with chocolate and meat grease, wrapped in the soft folds of a wool blanket. She thought about the knife in her bag, the one she had been prepared to use on herself. It seemed almost absurd now. She had been ready to die rather than face American captivity, but the Americans had not hurt her. They had fed her. They had given her warmth. They had shown her more kindness in one night than she had known in months, and that kindness terrified her more than any threat ever could. Because if the Americans were not the monsters she had been told they were, then what else had been a lie? The days that followed established a pattern that bewildered the women almost as much as that first night had. Each morning, soldiers brought breakfast. Not scraps or leftovers, but actual meals. Oatmeal with sugar, canned milk, coffee, sometimes eggs and bread. The women ate in silence at first, unable to meet the eyes of the soldiers who served them, but slowly, over days, they began to relax. After breakfast, they were allowed to wash. The Americans had set up a bathing area with canvas screens for privacy and barrels of heated water. The first time Keiko stepped behind the screen and poured warm water over herself, she wept. She had not been properly clean in months. The water ran brown and gray off her body, carrying away layers of dirt and dried sweat and the stench of caves and fear. When she emerged, her skin pink from scrubbing, she felt almost human again. The Americans also provided soap. Real soap, not the harsh lye bars the Japanese military had rationed, but gentle soap that smelled of flowers. Yumi held a bar to her nose and inhaled deeply, a smile crossing her face for the first time since capture. "Roses," she said softly. "It smells like roses." She closed her eyes, and for a moment she was transported back to her family's garden in Osaka, before the war, before everything fell apart. Midday brought more food. Lunch was usually canned vegetables, meat, and fruit. The portions were generous, far more than any of them could eat after months of near starvation. Some women made themselves sick from eating too much too fast, their bodies unaccustomed to abundance. The American medics came to treat them, gentle and efficient, administering medicine and advice through gestures and broken Japanese phrases they had learned. In the afternoons, the women were left largely alone. The soldiers checked on them periodically but did not intrude. The women spent these hours talking quietly among themselves, mending their clothes with thread the Americans had provided, or simply sitting in silence, trying to process their situation. Some wrote letters to families they did not know were alive or dead, letters that might never be sent but which provided a fragile connection to the world they had lost. Keiko found paper and a pencil among the supplies and began keeping a journal. She wrote about the blankets and the tea, about the food and the soap, about the strange gentleness of the enemy. She wrote about her confusion, her guilt, her growing realization that everything she had believed was built on lies. The act of writing helped her organize her thoughts, though it did not ease the turmoil in her heart. Evening brought dinner, and with it more impossible abundance. Hot meals, sometimes even fresh food prepared by American cooks. Vegetables and meat, rice occasionally, bread always. The Americans seemed determined to feed them back to health, and slowly it was working. The women's cheeks began to fill out. Color returned to their faces. Their eyes, once hollow and dead, began to show signs of life again. But the physical healing only made the psychological wounds more apparent. As their bodies recovered, their minds struggled with the contradiction of their situation. They were prisoners, but they were treated better than they had been as free citizens of Japan during the war's final year. The paradox was inescapable and deeply troubling. 2 weeks after their capture, the Americans arranged for mail delivery. It was the first contact many of the women had with the outside world since the battle ended. When the soldier brought the bundle of letters to the schoolhouse, the women crowded around eagerly, desperate for news of their families. Keiko's hands trembled as she opened the envelope with her name on it. The letter was from her younger brother, written on thin paper in shaky handwriting. She read it once, twice, 3 times, each reading making the words more real and more painful. Her parents were alive but living in a bombed-out building in Kyoto. They had no food except what they could beg or find in the ruins. Her brother, only 15, was working 12 hours a day clearing rubble for a handful of rice. He asked if she had any food to send. He asked if she was alive. He asked when she would come home. She looked down at the half-eaten chocolate bar beside her, at the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, at the cup of hot tea still steaming in her hands. Her family was starving in the ruins of Japan while she lived in relative comfort as a prisoner of war. The guilt crashed over her like a wave, stealing her breath, making her chest tight with shame. Around her, other women were reading their own letters, and similar scenes were playing out. Yumi's letter told her that her mother had died during the firebombing of Osaka. Her father was missing, likely dead. Her younger sister was living in a refugee camp, sick with dysentery and malnutrition. Yumi sat very still after reading, the letter clutched in her hands, her face blank with shock and grief. Sachiko learned that her son, a soldier, had died on Iwo Jima months earlier. Her husband had been killed in the bombing of Hiroshima. She had no one left. She was alone in the world, a prisoner of the Americans, outliving her entire family while wrapped in an enemy blanket and drinking enemy tea. She did not cry. She simply folded the letter carefully and placed it in her pocket, her face like stone. That night, the women did not sleep well. Some cried softly into their blankets. Others stared at the ceiling, their minds thousands of miles away in ruined cities where their loved ones struggled to survive. The contrast between their situation and that of their families was unbearable. They were safe. They were fed. They were warm. And their people were dying. Keiko lay awake, the letter from her brother still in her hand. She thought about the propaganda she had been fed, the promises that Japan would never surrender, that victory was certain, that the emperor would protect them, all lies. The government had sacrificed its people for nothing. And now the enemy, the Americans they had been taught to hate and fear, were the ones providing care while Japan left its citizens to starve in rubble. The irony was crushing. The contradiction gnawed at her soul. How could she reconcile this? How could any of them? As the weeks passed, individual Americans began to stand out from the mass of uniforms. There was a young soldier named Private Miller who always smiled when he brought the morning tea. He had kind eyes and a gentle manner, and he made an effort to learn basic Japanese phrases. "Ohayo gozaimasu," he would say each morning, his accent terrible but his effort touching. "Good morning." The women began to look forward to his visits. Another soldier, an older man with gray in his hair, brought them a portable radio one afternoon. He set it up in the schoolhouse and tuned it to a station playing American music. Then he showed them how to change the dial, gesturing with patient enthusiasm. When he left, the women gathered around the radio, fascinated. The music was strange, all horns and rhythms they did not recognize, but it was also oddly comforting. It filled the silence with something other than their own troubled thoughts. Yumi became particularly attached to the radio. She would sit beside it for hours, listening to the incomprehensible English broadcasts, occasionally catching a Japanese program aimed at occupied populations. One day, Miller noticed her interest and brought her a small notebook. Through gestures and drawings, he showed her how to write down the English words she heard. She began keeping a vocabulary list, learning the language of the enemy not from hatred, but from genuine curiosity. One evening, Keiko was outside the schoolhouse, watching the sunset over the ocean, when Miller approached. He held out a pack of cigarettes, offering her one. She did not smoke, but she took it anyway, not wanting to seem rude. He lit it for her, then lit his own, and they stood together in companionable silence, watching the sky turn orange and pink and purple. After a while, Miller pulled out his wallet and showed her a photograph. A woman and two small children, smiling in front of a white house. "My wife," he said, pointing. "My kids." He looked at the photo with such obvious love and longing that Keiko felt her throat tighten. This was the enemy. This American soldier who had probably killed Japanese men in battle. And he was just a man who missed his family, who carried their picture next to his heart, who showed kindness to enemy prisoners because it was the right thing to do. Keiko pulled out her own photograph, the one of her parents in Kyoto, and showed it to him. "My family," she said in halting English, one of the few phrases she had learned. Miller looked at the photo and nodded seriously as if acknowledging the shared humanity of their losses and hopes. Then he handed it back carefully and said something she did not fully understand, but the tone was sympathetic and kind. They finished their cigarettes in silence. When Miller left, Keiko stood there for a long time, the photograph still in her hand, trying to understand how the world had become so complicated. The enemy was supposed to be inhuman, but Miller was more human than many. Of the Japanese officers she had served under during the war, he showed more compassion than the propaganda had ever promised from her own side. Memory collided with reality. Everything she had been taught was crumbling, piece by piece, undermined by small acts of decency that should not have existed in war, but somehow did. By the end of the first month, the physical changes in the women were remarkable. They had arrived as walking skeletons, gaunt and hollow-eyed, their skin stretched over bone, their hair falling out from malnutrition. Now, fed 3 meals a day plus snacks, their bodies began to heal. Cheeks filled out, skin regained elasticity, eyes brightened. Even their hair, once dull and brittle, began to shine again. Yumi, who had weighed perhaps 80 pounds when captured, gained 15 pounds in that first month. She looked at herself in a small mirror the Americans had provided and barely recognized her own face. There was color in her cheeks. Her eyes no longer sank into her skull. She looked young again, like the girl she had been before the war consumed everything. But the physical healing only made the emotional wounds more apparent. Keiko wrote in her journal, "My body grows strong on American food while my family starves on ashes. I sleep on American blankets while my brother sleeps on rubble. How can I accept this? How can I not? To refuse their help is to die. To accept it is to betray everything I believed. There is no right choice. There is only survival, and the shame that comes with it." The women began to wear the clothes the Americans provided. Clean shirts and pants, not fashionable, but functional and whole, without holes or bloodstains. Some resisted at first, clinging to their torn Japanese garments as a form of defiance or loyalty. But eventually even they gave in. The American clothes were warmer, cleaner, more comfortable, and slowly, piece by piece, they shed the physical remnants of their old lives. Sachiko, the oldest among them, looked at her hands one evening and did not recognize them. They were clean, the nails trimmed, the skin soft from American soap. These were not the hands of a woman who had survived war. These were the hands of someone who had been cared for. She felt a wave of self-loathing. She should be suffering. Her son was dead. Her husband was dead. Japan was destroyed. And here she was, hands soft with enemy soap, belly full of enemy food, alive when so many had died. The guilt was a constant companion. It sat beside them at meals, reminding them that every bite they took was a bite their families did not have. It lay with them at night, whispering that they did not deserve the warmth of their blankets. It followed them through the days, a shadow that no amount of American kindness could dispel. And yet, beneath the guilt, something else was growing. A small, tentative recognition that perhaps survival was not betrayal, that perhaps accepting help, even from the enemy, was not weakness but wisdom, that perhaps the propaganda had been wrong about more than just American cruelty, perhaps it had been wrong about everything. The psychological battle that raged within each woman was more brutal than any physical combat they had endured. They had been taught from childhood that Americans were barbarians, that Western culture was corrupt and weak, that Japan's divine mission was to free Asia from their influence. The propaganda had been relentless, sophisticated, and deeply internalized. It was not just something they believed, it was woven into their understanding of the world. And now every meal, every blanket, every kind word from an American soldier challenged that worldview. It was not a gentle challenge, it was an assault on everything they had built their identities upon. Keiko found herself waking at night in a cold sweat, her mind spinning with contradictions that had no resolution. If the Americans were not monsters, then why had Japan fought so desperately? If they were capable of kindness, why had her government warned her to die rather than be captured? If they treated prisoners with dignity, what did that say about the Japanese military's treatment of its own people? The questions spiraled endlessly, each one opening up new chasms of doubt. Yumi struggled with different questions. She had believed in the Emperor's divinity, in Japan's sacred destiny, in the righteousness of their cause. But how could a righteous cause leave her mother dead in the ruins of Osaka? How could a divine emperor allow his people to starve while the enemy fed prisoners of war? The cognitive dissonance was physically painful, manifesting as headaches and nausea, her body rebelling against thoughts her mind could not process. Some women clung desperately to the old beliefs. One woman, Haruko, refused to accept the evidence before her eyes. "It is strategy," she insisted during their evening discussions. "They fatten us now so that we will cooperate later. They want us to betray our country, to become spies or worse. This kindness is a weapon, more insidious than torture because it attacks our loyalty." But as weeks turned to months, even Haruko's resistance began to crack. The Americans never asked them to betray anything. They never demanded information or cooperation. They simply provided care, day after day, with no apparent expectation of return. And that unshakable consistency was more devastating to the propaganda's hold than any argument could have been. The women's discussions grew more intense and philosophical as time went on. In the evenings, after the Americans had brought dinner and left them alone, they would gather in a circle, wrapped in their blankets, and wrestle with impossible questions. These conversations were raw and painful, but necessary. Each woman needed to hear that others shared her confusion, her guilt, her slow and terrifying shift in perspective. If the enemy values our lives, why did our own leaders not? The question came from Sachiko one night, her voice barely a whisper. The silence that followed was heavy with implications none of them wanted to acknowledge, because acknowledging it meant accepting that their government had valued them less than the enemy did. It meant accepting that Japanese lives had been expendable in the eyes of Japanese leadership. It meant rewriting everything they understood about loyalty and duty and sacrifice. Keiko tried to articulate what many were feeling. "We were told that death was preferable to capture, that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. But what honor is there in dying when you could live? What honor is there in refusing help when your body is starving? Perhaps the dishonor was not in surrendering. Perhaps the dishonor was in the lie that told us surrender was shameful." Her words hung in the air, dangerous and liberating. Several women nodded slowly, others looked away, not yet ready to accept such a radical revision of their understanding. But the seed was planted. Once spoken, the thought could not be unthought. Yumi contributed her own observation. "The Americans have rules. They follow the Geneva Convention. I heard one of them talking about it. They treat prisoners well because their laws say they must. But Japan rejected the Geneva Convention. We had no such laws protecting us. So when our own soldiers were captured, they suffered. And when we became prisoners, we expected to suffer. But we did not because the Americans followed rules our own country refused to accept." The realization spread through the group like a slow-burning fire. Japan had chosen not to protect its own people by rejecting international law. Japan had chosen a path that led inevitably to the suffering of its soldiers and civilians. And the Americans, the supposed barbarians, had followed rules that ultimately showed more humanity than Japan's doctrine of death before dishonor. "But what about what they did to our cities?" Haruko challenged, still resisting. "What about the firebombing? What about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? How can we call them humane when they burned our people alive?" The question was fair and cut deep. No one could answer it easily. Finally, Sachiko spoke. "War is evil. All sides commit evil in war. But here now, in this moment, they have chosen not to add to that evil. They could hurt us. They have every reason to hate us, but they do not hurt us. Does that erase what they did to our cities? No, but does what they did to our Cities erase what they are doing for us now? Also no. We can hold both truths at once. They are capable of terrible destruction and unexpected kindness, just like us, just like everyone. The complexity of that truth was exhausting. It would have been easier to live in a world of absolute good and absolute evil, where the enemy was purely monstrous and one's own side was purely righteous. But reality was messier. Reality demanded that they see the Americans as human beings capable of both cruelty and compassion, just as they had to see their own nation as capable of both noble sacrifice and terrible mistakes. As the women learned more English and as some of the bilingual American officers began to talk with them, new concepts filtered into their understanding. The Americans spoke about ideas that were foreign to Japanese ears: individual rights, freedom of speech, government accountability. These were not just abstract political concepts. They were the foundation of why the Americans treated prisoners as they did. One afternoon, an American officer named Lieutenant Patterson came to the schoolhouse with a Japanese-American interpreter. He wanted to explain why they were treated well. Through the interpreter, he said, "In America, we believe every person has value, not because of their rank or their nationality, but because they are human. The Geneva Convention says prisoners of war must be treated humanely. We follow that not just because it is law, but because we believe it is right. You are not our enemies anymore. The war is over. You are just people who need help, and it is our duty to provide it." The women listened with a mixture of skepticism and wonder. The idea that they had value simply for being human was revolutionary. In Japan, value came from service to the emperor, from fulfilling one's duty, from subordinating individual needs to collective goals. Personal worth was derived from one's role, not from one's existence. But the Americans seemed to believe something fundamentally different. Keiko raised her hand tentatively and asked through the interpreter, "But we were your enemies. We fought against you. Some of us may have helped kill American soldiers. How can you care for us?" Lieutenant Patterson thought for a moment before answering. "The war made us enemies. But the war is over. Holding on to hatred now serves no purpose. You did not start this war. You were caught up in it, same as all of us. Punishing you would not bring back the dead. But helping you might build a better future. That is what we choose to believe." His words struck Keiko deeply. The idea that hatred was a choice, something one could decide to let go of, was almost incomprehensible. In Japan, loyalty and enmity were presented as absolute, unchanging, dictated by duty and honor. But the Americans seemed to view these things as more flexible, subject to reason and compassion rather than rigid obligation. That night, the women discussed Patterson's visit extensively. Yumi was particularly struck by something he had said about democracy. He said in America, the government serves the people, not the other way around. Can you imagine? A government that is accountable to its citizens? That exists to protect their rights rather than demand their sacrifice? "It sounds like a fantasy," Haruko said, but her voice lacked conviction. Everything about America had seemed like a fantasy until they experienced it themselves. Perhaps this too was real. Sachiko spoke quietly. "Our government told us to die for the emperor. We were willing to do it. But when I look back now, I wonder what we would have died for. Japan is destroyed. Our cities are rubble. Our people starve. What was preserved by all that sacrifice? The Americans are here anyway. We are occupied anyway. But if we had surrendered sooner, how many lives would have been saved? My son might still be alive. Your families might not be starving in ruins. Was our loyalty wisdom or was it waste?" No one could answer. The question was too painful, the implications too vast. They sat in silence, each woman alone with her thoughts, wrestling with the terrible possibility that their suffering had been unnecessary, that their sacrifices had been demanded by a government that valued its own power more than the lives of its people. Keiko came to understand something that she later wrote in her journal, words that captured what all of them were slowly realizing. The Americans defeated us with bombs and bullets, but they conquered us with blankets and tea. Violence we could have resisted, kindness we cannot. Because kindness forces us to see our enemies as human, and once you see the humanity in your enemy, you must also see the inhumanity in what you were told about them. The greatest weapon is not the one that destroys the body, but the one that destroys the lie. This recognition was the turning point for many of the women. The blankets and tea that first night had not been acts of weakness or strategy. They had been demonstrations of a fundamental philosophical difference between how the Americans viewed human worth and how the Japanese militarists had. The Americans had weapons, power, and victory. They could have done anything they wanted to their prisoners, but they chose compassion, and that choice revealed more about their character than any propaganda could have conveyed. Yumi expressed it more simply. They show us dignity because they believe we deserve it. Our own government showed us honor only when we served its purposes. When we surrendered, when we could no longer be useful, our leaders would have preferred us dead. But the Americans feed us even though we are useless to them. That is the difference. That is what I cannot forget. The The transformation was not complete or uniform. Some women still struggled with loyalty to Japan, still felt the pull of the old beliefs. But the foundation had been shaken. The absolute certainty of propaganda had been replaced by the messy complexity of lived experience. And once that happened, there was no going back to the simple worldview of before. 3 months into their captivity, the Americans arranged for a photographer to come and take identification photos of all the prisoners. It was standard procedure, documentation for records, and eventual repatriation. But when the women saw the photographs a few days later, they experienced a collective shock that crystallized everything they had been feeling. Keiko stared at her photo in disbelief. The woman in the picture looked healthy, almost content. Her cheeks were full, her skin clear, her eyes bright. She wore clean American-issued clothing. Her hair, which had been falling out from malnutrition when she was captured, now looked thick and healthy. This was not the face of a prisoner of war. This was the face of someone who had been cared for. She compared this image to the last photograph she had before the war, one taken in Kyoto when she was training to be a nurse. She had looked happy then, but thin even in peacetime Japan. Now as a prisoner of the enemy, she looked healthier than she had as a free citizen of her own country. The irony was devastating. Yumi held her photograph with shaking hands. "I look like myself again," she whispered. "I look like I did before the war. How is that possible? We are prisoners. We should look like prisoners." But they did not. They looked like people who had been rescued, not captured. That night, the women passed around their photographs, comparing them to faded pictures they carried of themselves before the war, or to memories of what they had looked like during the final desperate months of fighting. The transformation was undeniable. Enemy captivity had restored them in a way freedom under their own government had not. Sachiko looked at her photo for a long time, then began to cry. They were not tears of sadness, but of recognition, the painful acknowledgement of a truth she could no longer deny. "My son died for Japan," she said through her tears. "He died thin and hungry and far from home, and I live, fat and warm in enemy hands. What does that mean? What does any of it mean?" The photographs catalyzed something that had been building for months. That evening the women gathered in their now familiar circle, but the conversation was different. There was an urgency to it, a sense that they had reached a point of no return. They could no longer avoid the central question that haunted them all. "We must speak the truth," Keiko said, her voice steady despite the fear she felt at voicing what they all thought. "Our government lied to us, about the Americans, about the war, about what honor and duty truly mean. They sent our men to die for nothing. They left our people to starve. And when we surrendered, when we finally stopped fighting an unwinnable war, the enemy treated us with more humanity than our own leaders ever did." The words hung in the air, treasonous and true. Several women gasped. Haruko looked like she wanted to object, but she did not. Even she could not deny it anymore. The evidence was overwhelming. The propaganda had been lies, all of it. Yumi spoke next, her young voice trembling but determined. "I was taught the Emperor was divine, that Japan's cause was sacred, that Americans were devils. But if the Emperor is divine, why did he allow Japan to be destroyed? If our cause was sacred, why are our cities in ruins? And if Americans are devils, why do they feed us and clothe us and treat us with respect?" She looked around the circle, meeting each woman's eyes. "I think perhaps captivity revealed more truth than freedom ever did, because freedom as we knew it was just another form of captivity. We were prisoners of lies. And now, imprisoned by the enemy, we are finally free to see clearly." The paradox she described resonated with everyone. They had been more constrained by Japanese propaganda than they were by American barbed wire. The mental prison had been more complete than any physical one could be. And the Americans, by treating them with unexpected humanity, had inadvertently freed them from that mental captivity. Sachiko, the eldest, spoke with the authority of her years and suffering. "I have lost everything. My son, my husband, my home, my country as I knew it. All I have left is truth. And the truth is this. Kindness cuts deeper than cruelty. Cruelty confirms what you believe about your enemies. But kindness forces you to question everything. The Americans showed us kindness when we expected horror, and that kindness has destroyed the fortress of lies we lived in more completely than any bomb ever could." Around the circle, women were nodding, some crying, others sitting in stunned silence. The transformation was complete, or as complete as such profound ideological shifts could ever be. They had entered this captivity as loyal subjects of Imperial Japan, believers in its righteousness and victims of its propaganda. They were leaving it as something else entirely. Women who had seen through the lies, who understood the cost of blind loyalty, who recognized humanity in unexpected places. That night, Keiko wrote what would become her most important journal entry, one she would keep for the rest of her life and eventually share with her children decades later. 3 months ago, I was prepared to die rather than be captured by Americans. I had a knife. I was ready to use it. I believed everything I had been told. That Americans were monsters. That capture meant horror worse than death. that loyalty demanded I choose suicide over surrender. Tonight I sit wrapped in an American blanket, my stomach full of American food, my body healthy from American care, and I realize that everything I believed was a lie. Not a small lie or a partial lie, but a complete inversion of truth. The Americans are not monsters. They are people like us, capable of compassion and cruelty, but choosing compassion even when they have every excuse for cruelty. They follow rules that protect even their enemies. They value human life, even enemy life, in a way our government never valued ours. I am angry. I am angry at the leaders who lied to us, who sent our soldiers to die for nothing, who would rather we kill ourselves than surrender to an enemy who would treat us humanely. I am angry at the propaganda that filled our heads with false horrors. I am angry at myself for believing it all without question. But I am also grateful. Grateful to be alive. Grateful for the Americans who chose kindness over vengeance. Grateful for this painful awakening, because living in truth, however painful, is better than living in comforting lies. The blankets and tea that first night were not just gifts. They were truths wrapped in wool and warmth. They were proof that the world is more complicated than propaganda allows. They were evidence that humanity can survive even war's attempt to destroy it. I do not know what will happen when we return to Japan. I do not know how to live in a country rebuilt by the enemy I now see as more honorable than my own government. But I know I will carry this lesson forever. Question everything. Trust actions over words. And never forget that kindness, offered freely to those who have no power to demand it, reveals more about character than any amount of fierce loyalty ever could. She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest, feeling the weight of the transformation she had undergone. She was not the same person who had been captured 3 months ago. None of them were. The Americans had conquered Japan with military might, but they had conquered these women with something far more powerful and far more lasting. The undeniable demonstration that their propaganda had been lies and that humanity could exist even between sworn enemies. As 1946 arrived and the occupation of Japan became more established, talk of repatriation began. The women would eventually be sent home. This should have been good news, something to celebrate, but instead it filled them with complicated dread. Keiko lay awake at night thinking about her return to Kyoto. She would see her family again, her parents and brother who had survived. That was a blessing, but she would return to them as someone changed beyond recognition. How could she explain what she had learned in captivity? How could she tell them that the enemy had treated her better than her own government? How could she reconcile her new understanding with the grief and suffering of those who had lost everything? More than that, she feared the material contrast. She was healthy now, well-fed and strong. Her family was living in rubble, surviving on rations barely sufficient to sustain life. She would return to them with the glow of American care on her face, and they would be skeletal with starvation. The guilt was already unbearable at a distance. How much worse would it be in person? Yumi expressed a different fear. What if they hate us? What if they see us as traitors for surrendering? What if they think we collaborated with the enemy? It was a legitimate concern. Japan's culture of shame and honor meant that surrender carried deep stigma. Women who had been captured might be viewed as tainted, dishonored, unworthy of respect. They might return home only to find themselves outcasts. Sachiko, who had no family left to return to, faced a different emptiness. I do not know what I will do in Japan, she admitted quietly. Everything I knew is gone. The country will be unrecognizable, occupied by Americans, rebuilt in their image. I will be a ghost in my own homeland, belonging neither to the past nor the future. Yet despite these fears, there was also a strange sense of mission. They had learned something in captivity, something important that Japan needed to know. They had learned that the propaganda was lies, that the Americans were not monsters, that surrender did not have to mean dishonor, that kindness was possible even from enemies. If they could share that lesson, perhaps their captivity would have meaning. Perhaps it could help Japan heal. In February 1946, the women were told they would be repatriated within the month. The Americans prepared them carefully, providing clean clothes for the journey, medical checkups to ensure they were healthy enough to travel, and even small packages of food to take with them. Lieutenant Patterson came to say goodbye, shaking hands with each woman, wishing them well through the interpreter. On the day of departure, the women gathered their few possessions. Keiko packed her journal carefully, knowing it was the most valuable thing she owned. Yumi clutched the vocabulary notebook where she had been learning English, a reminder of her time in the schoolhouse. Sachiko folded her blanket, the same one she had received that first night, and asked if she could take it. The soldier in charge smiled and nodded. "Keep it," he said in broken Japanese. "Remember, we are not all bad." The voyage back to Japan was somber. The women stood on the deck of the ship, watching Okinawa recede into the distance, then disappear below the horizon. They were leaving behind their captivity, but they were also leaving behind a strange period of safety and abundance. None of them spoke of it, but all of them felt it. A reluctance to return to a Japan that had failed them. A fear of what they would find in the ruins. When they arrived at Yokohama port, the devastation was worse than they had imagined. The harbor was filled with sunken ships, their rusted hulls jutting from the water. The city beyond was a wasteland of rubble and twisted metal. People moved through the ruins like ghosts, thin and ragged, their faces hollow with hunger and loss. This was Japan now. This was what the war had left behind. The women disembarked in silence, their American-issued clothes marking them as former prisoners. Some Japanese on the dock stared at them with expressions that mixed curiosity, envy, and resentment. The women looked healthy, well-fed, clean. It was obvious they had been cared for. And in that moment, Keiko understood that the guilt would never leave her. She had survived and even thrived while her people suffered. There was no reconciling that, only enduring it. Keiko's journey to Kyoto took 2 days by train and foot, through a landscape that looked like the surface of the moon. Cities she remembered from before the war were now fields of ash, punctuated by concrete skeletons. Villages had vanished entirely. People lived in shacks made from scavenged materials, their eyes empty of hope. When she finally reached what had been her family's neighborhood, she almost did not recognize it. The street was gone. The houses were gone. In their place was rubble, organized into primitive shelters. She found her family in what had once been their basement, now covered with a roof made of corrugated metal and wood scraps. Her mother saw her first. The old woman stood slowly, staring as if at a ghost. Then she rushed forward, her frail arms wrapping around Keiko in a crushing embrace. She was crying, repeating her daughter's name over and over. Keiko's father emerged from the shelter, his face gaunt but alive, his eyes filling with tears. Her brother was there too, taller than she remembered, but skeletal thin, his eyes too old for his 16 years. They wept together, a tangle of thin arms and overwhelming emotion. But as the initial joy faded, Keiko became aware of the contrast between them. Her family looked like refugees, their clothes patched and repatched, their skin stretched over visible bones, their faces marked by deprivation. And she looked healthy, well-fed, whole. Her mother touched her face wonderingly. "You have meat on your bones," she whispered. "How?" Keiko told them the truth. She described her captivity, the blankets and tea that first night, the regular meals, the medical care, the unexpected humanity of the Americans. Her family listened in stunned silence. Her brother looked confused, as if he could not reconcile her words with what he had been taught. Her father looked troubled, his worldview visibly shaking. But her mother understood immediately. She pulled Keiko close and whispered in her ear, "Do not be ashamed that you were fed while we starved. Be angry at those who made you a prisoner while leaving us to die. The Americans did not destroy Japan. Our own leaders did. Never forget that." Those words gave Keiko permission to carry her guilt differently. It was not her fault that she had been cared for. It was not betrayal to have survived. The crime was not in accepting help from the enemy. The crime was in the leadership that had made that help necessary by destroying their own nation in a feudal war. Decades passed. Japan rebuilt, transformed from rubble into one of the world's great economic powers. The American occupation ended. Democracy took root, and the women who had been prisoners in Okinawa became part of the generation that lived through Japan's greatest transformation. Keiko married, had children, and eventually grandchildren. She became a teacher, working with young people in the new Japan. She kept her journal from the war hidden for many years, unsure if anyone would understand or care about what she had experienced. But as she grew older, she began to share her story. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, a journalist interviewed her for a special magazine feature about women's experiences during the war. She spoke publicly for the first time about the blankets and tea, about the unexpected kindness of American soldiers, about the brutal awakening to propaganda's lies. "What did that experience teach you?" the journalist asked. Keiko thought carefully before answering. "It taught me that humanity is always a choice. The Americans could have chosen cruelty. They had won the war. They had every excuse. But they chose compassion. And that choice changed my life more profoundly than any battle could have." She continued, "It also taught me to question everything, to trust actions over words. Our government told us beautiful lies about honor and duty while leading us to destruction. The Americans told us nothing but showed us through their actions what they valued. I learned to judge people not by their propaganda, but by how they treat those who have no power to demand good treatment." The journalist asked if she hated the Americans for what they did to Japan's cities. Keiko shook her head. "I hate war. I hate what it does to everyone. But I cannot hate people who, when they had power over me, chose mercy. I can hold both truths. They destroyed our cities and they showed us compassion. Life is complicated. People are complicated. That is what war and its aftermath taught me." Before she died in 1997, Keiko gave her war journal to her granddaughter, along with the blanket she had kept for 50 years. "Remember this," she told the young woman. Remember that kindness from an unexpected source has more power than any weapon. Remember that propaganda always lies about the enemy's humanity. And remember that survival is not betrayal. Living to tell the truth is the greatest form of resistance. And so the blankets and hot tea became more than simple comforts on a cold night in September 1945. They became proof that even in war's darkest hour, humanity can survive. They became evidence that enemies can choose compassion over cruelty, that victory does not require vengeance, that the strongest position is one from which you can afford to be merciful. For those 23 Japanese women, that first night in American captivity shattered everything they believed about the world. They had been prepared for horror and received kindness. They had expected monsters and found human beings. They had braced for assault and received blankets and tea, and that contradiction forced them to rebuild their entire understanding of loyalty, duty, honor, and truth. The Americans who brought those blankets probably did not think they were doing anything extraordinary. They were simply following the Geneva Convention, treating prisoners as their regulations required, doing what they believed was right. But to the women who received those gifts, it was revolutionary. It proved that the propaganda had been lies. It demonstrated that honor could exist without cruelty, that strength could coexist with compassion, that winning did not require destroying the enemy's humanity. This story reminds us that the tools of war are not always weapons. Sometimes the most powerful tool is simple human decency. The blankets did not erase the firebombing of Japanese cities. The tea did not bring back the dead. But they did something perhaps more important. They proved that people are more complex than propaganda allows, that enemies can show unexpected humanity, and that sometimes mercy cuts deeper than any sword. As Keiko told her granddaughter decades later, "That night, wrapped in an American blanket, drinking American tea, I learned the hardest lesson of my life. The enemy was not who I thought. My own government was not who I thought. And I was not who I thought. Everything I believed had been built on lies. But truth once found cannot be unlost. And living in truth, however painful, is the only way to truly be free." If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you forgotten true accounts from World War II that reveal the complicated humanity behind the history. These stories matter because they remind us that even in humanity's darkest moments, light can break through in unexpected ways, and that is a lesson we should never forget. Thank you for watching.